There are strange happenings in Yosemite. The stories are passed down by park rangers who've worked the remote trails long enough to have experienced things they cannot explain. This is one of those tales that gets shared infrequently. It usually starts with the older rangers, the ones who've been around for decades, leaning in and saying, "You ever hear about Mike, the guy who saw something he shouldn't have, out in the backcountry?" Mike Daniels was a seasoned ranger, someone who had worked in Yosemite for over 15 years. He had hiked more trails than most others and patrolled its most remote areas. You had to have a thick skin to deal with the long hours, an unpredictable wilderness that Yosemite threw at you. But one summer evening in 2009, something happened that Mike couldn't shake. It started out like any other shift. Mike had been assigned to check on some remote campsites along the northern boundary of the park, near the Tenaya Canyon area. It's a rugged, isolated section of Yosemite, far from the more tourist-heavy spots, and known for its wild, untouched beauty. Few people ventured out that far, but it was part of the job to make sure the backcountry was clear and that no one was camping illegally. He set out in the afternoon, hiking a few miles before the sun started to dip low behind the granite cliffs. He figured he'd make his last stop before dusk, then set up his own camp for the night. As he moved deeper into the canyon, the sense of isolation grew. The towering trees and granite walls swallowed any sound, leaving the air thick with the kind of feeling that he usually enjoyed. Mike had been in these woods 1,000 times before, but something about that evening had him looking around more intently. The birds had gone silent. Even the usual rustling of small animals in the underbrush seemed absent. By the time he reached his last stop, it was almost dark. He checked the campsite, but it was empty, just as he expected. After radioing back to let the team know everything was clear, he set up his camp nearby, figuring he'd head back early the next morning. That night, sitting by his small fire, Mike kept feeling like someone else was out there with him, which was unnerving for a remote area like this. He'd spent enough time in the backcountry to know the sounds of the wilderness, and this kind of silence was rare, unnatural almost. As the fire crackled, he heard it, a soft, rhythmic thumping in the distance. It sounded like footsteps, but too heavy to be a person, and too slow to be any of the animals native to the area. Something about the rhythm of the steps made him uneasy. Bears didn't walk with that kind of deliberate, almost human-like cadence. Grabbing his flashlight, Mike stood up, shining the beam into the trees beyond his campsite. Nothing. The light cut through the darkness, but there was no sign of movement. Still, the footsteps continued, coming closer, then stopping altogether. He called out, "Hello? Anyone out there?" Silence. Mike's hand hovered near the handle of his bear spray, just in case. He stood there listening, but the footsteps had stopped. Slowly, he backed toward the fire, keeping his eyes on the tree line. After a while, he convinced himself it was probably nothing out of the ordinary, maybe a deer or an elk. He sat back down, trying to relax, but the uneasy feeling stuck with him. The night wore on, and eventually, he drifted off to sleep. Sometime in the dead of night, Mike woke up suddenly. At first, he wasn't sure why. There was no sound, no movement, just the quiet darkness of the forest. But then he noticed something strange, the smell. A pungent, musky odor hung in the air, thick and sour. It was unlike anything he'd ever smelled in the woods before. He sat up, reaching for his flashlight, and that's when he heard it again. The same heavy footsteps, but this time, they were much closer. His heart started racing. Shining the light out into the darkness, he scanned the area around his camp, but again, nothing moved. Then, just at the edge of his firelight, he saw it. A massive figure, standing at least 7 or 8 feet tall, partially hidden behind a tree. Its outline was unmistakable. Broad shoulders, long arms, and covered in what looked like thick, matted hair. Mike's breath caught in his throat. He had seen enough photos and heard enough stories from locals to know exactly what it looked like. The word Bigfoot flashed in his mind, though he'd never given much thought to the legend before that moment. The creature stood there perfectly still, as if it was watching him, sizing him up. Mike's hand tightened on his flashlight, and for a brief moment, neither of them moved. It was like a silent standoff. man and beast, both unsure of the other's next move. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature stepped back into the shadows, disappearing into the forest without a sound. Mike stood frozen, his mind racing. He wanted to chase after it, to get a better look, but his instincts told him to stay put. Whatever that thing was, it didn't seem aggressive, but it was big enough to be dangerous. For the rest of the night, Mike didn't sleep. He kept his fire going, sitting with his flashlight in one hand and his bear spray in the other, listening for any sign that the creature had returned. But the footsteps never came back, and by morning, the forest was quiet again. When he hiked out the next day, Mike didn't tell anyone what he had seen. He knew how it would sound. A ranger claiming to have seen Bigfoot in Yosemite, he'd be a laughingstock. But the image of that creature, standing there just beyond the firelight, stayed with him. Over the years, Mike shared the story with only a few other rangers. The ones he knew wouldn't think he was crazy. And as it turned out, he wasn't the only one who had seen something like it. Other rangers, hikers, even campers in the more remote parts of the park had reported strange sightings. Tall, hairy figures moving through the trees, heavy footsteps in the dead of night, and that same musky, sour smell hanging in the air. Officially, there's no record of any Bigfoot sightings in Yosemite. But talk to enough people who've spent time deep in the backcountry, and you'll start to hear the stories. Mike never went looking for the creature again, but he knew what he saw that night. And even now, years later, there are still nights when he's out on patrol, and he gets that same uneasy feeling, like something's watching him from just beyond the trees. There's a story out of a small desert town in Arizona that has left a lot of people scratching their heads. It involves a woman named Sarah who lived just outside Phoenix, in a quiet neighborhood near the edge of the desert. Sarah was in her late 30s, worked from home, and lived a pretty normal life. She was an avid hiker, loved the outdoors, and often spent her evenings walking her dog, a golden retriever named Max. It was late August, the kind of hot evening where the desert air still felt like it was clinging to the heat of the day. Sarah usually waited until it cooled down a bit before taking Max out for a walk. They had a familiar route they followed, past a few houses, through a small park, and then down a dirt trail that led out toward the desert. The trail wasn't too far from the residential area, but it was far enough that you could see the wide, open landscape stretch out before you. That particular evening, something felt a little different. Sarah couldn't quite put her finger on it. The air was still, which wasn't unusual for the desert, but it was quiet, too quiet. Normally, there were at least a few sounds. The distant hum of cars on the highway, maybe a coyote yipping in the distance, or the faint rustle of wind through the sparse desert brush. But tonight, it felt like everything was muffled, like the world had been turned down a notch. Max, usually full of energy, was oddly subdued. He walked beside her, his ears perked, but he wasn't pulling on the leash or sniffing around like usual. He just stayed close, like he was listening for something Sarah couldn't hear. They had just passed the last few houses and were about to head onto the dirt trail when Max suddenly stopped. His body stiffened, and he let out a low growl. Sarah looked down at him, confused. He wasn't a skittish dog, and it wasn't like him to growl at nothing. "Come on, Max," she said, tugging on the leash gently. But Max wouldn't budge. His eyes were fixed on something ahead, down the trail toward the open desert. Sarah followed his gaze, squinting in the fading light. At first, she didn't see anything. But then, just beyond where the dirt path curved into the darkness, she noticed something. A figure, standing still, just outside the glow of the streetlights. It was hard to make out any details, but it looked like a person. They were just standing there, not moving, not walking, just watching. It wasn't unusual to see other people out here, but something about the way this figure stood, completely motionless, made her very uneasy. She decided to turn back, tugging on Max's leash a little harder this time. Max hesitated but eventually followed, though he kept looking back over his shoulder, his ears flat against his head. As they walked away, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She glanced back a few times, but the figure was gone. The trail behind her was empty, just the dark desert stretching out into the horizon. Back home, she tried to forget about it, chalking it up to someone else out for a walk, or maybe a stray hiker who had wandered off the main trail. But Max's behavior stuck with her. He had never reacted like that before, and it left her feeling unsettled. The next evening, despite her unease, Sarah took Max for another walk. This time, she decided to stick closer to the neighborhood, avoiding the desert trail. Everything was normal at first. Max seemed back to his usual self, sniffing around and trotting happily beside her. But as they neared the edge of the neighborhood, where the houses thinned out and the desert began again, Max stopped dead in his tracks. This time, Sarah immediately felt it too, the sensation that someone was watching them. She looked around, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Then, she heard it, a faint rustling sound, like footsteps in the sand. She whipped around, scanning the area, but saw no one. The desert was empty. Max growled again, his fur standing on end. Sarah decided to cut the walk short, pulling Max back toward home. As they hurried back, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was out there, just beyond her sight, keeping pace with them. Over the next few days, the feeling only intensified. Every time she took Max for a walk, no matter where she went, that same sense of being watched crept in. Sometimes she thought she saw movement out of the corner of her eye, but when she turned, there was nothing there, just the empty desert. Then, one night, things escalated. It was around 11 p.m., and Sarah was letting Max out into the backyard before bed. Her yard backed up against the desert, with only a low fence separating her property from the open land beyond. As Max trotted out, he suddenly stopped at the edge of the yard, his nose pressed against the fence. His growl was low and threatening. Sarah, standing in the doorway, felt her stomach drop. There, standing just beyond the fence, was the same figure she had seen on the trail. This time, it was closer, clearer. The figure was tall, unnaturally tall, with long limbs that didn't seem quite right. Its face was obscured by shadow, but its posture, the way it stood perfectly still, made Sarah's brain short-circuit. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, without warning, the figure seemed to glide backward, disappearing into the darkness of the desert. Sarah didn't sleep that night. She called the local authorities the next morning, but they found nothing. No footprints, no signs that anyone had been there. They suggested it might have been an animal or even her imagination, but Sarah knew better. Max had seen it too. Over the following weeks, Sarah heard from a few neighbors that they had also seen strange figures at the edge of the desert, always just out of reach, always watching. No one could explain it, and eventually, the sightings stopped, but the feeling never really went away. To this day, Sarah avoids the desert at night, and she's never walked Max down that trail again. She doesn't know what was out there, but whatever it was, it didn't belong in the desert or anywhere near her home. There's a case out of Miami that's been passed around the local precincts for a while now, though you'll never find it in any official records. Most of the officers who know about it won't even bring it up, unless they've had a few drinks or trust you enough to think you won't laugh them out of the room. But it's become one of those urban legends in the department, a story that makes the rounds, especially with the night shift officers who've been on the force long enough to hear the stranger reports. It all started with Officer Jake Morales, a guy known for being pretty straightforward. He wasn't the type to spook easily, even after 12 years on the Miami PD. He'd seen just about everything you could in the city, from intense domestic fights to high-speed chases. But this one night in June 2021, it rattled him in a way nothing else had. It was a quiet Monday evening, around 2 a.m., and Morales was patrolling in the Wynwood district. The area had cleaned up a lot over the years, becoming one of Miami's trendy spots with all the art galleries and restaurants. But some parts still had that gritty old Miami vibe. Morales had been driving past an old vacant building that used to be a nightclub back in the day, one that had been shut down for years. The kind of place where you'd think twice about walking past alone at night, even with all the gentrification happening around it. As Morales passed by, he noticed something odd, a light flickering in one of the upper windows. The building had been abandoned for years, power cut off and boarded up. Thinking it might be squatters or vandals, Morales pulled over to check it out. He radioed in that he was investigating the building but didn't expect much. Maybe some kids messing around, or a homeless person looking for shelter. But as soon as he got out of the car, the atmosphere felt off. The humidity hung heavy, like usual in Miami. But the air around the building seemed still, almost like it was waiting for something. As he walked toward the building, he saw movement in the window. It was fast, too fast. At first, he thought it was a reflection, but no, there was definitely someone or something inside. He approached cautiously, flashlight in one hand, the other on his holstered sidearm. The front door was locked, so he made his way around the side, where an old emergency exit door hung slightly ajar. Inside, it was pitch black, save for his flashlight beam cutting through the dust-filled air. The place smelled like mildew and stale alcohol, remnants of its nightclub days. Morales called out, "Miami PD, anyone here?" His voice echoed, but no response came. He climbed a set of stairs to the second floor, where he had seen the light earlier. As he approached, he could hear faint footsteps ahead of him, just around the corner, moving in a slow, dragging rhythm. He reached the top of the stairs and shone his light down the hallway. That's when he saw it. At the far end, standing by the window, was a figure, tall, unmoving, and completely still. "Police! Let me see your hands!" Morales shouted, his voice firm. But the figure didn't move, didn't even flinch. It was just standing there, silhouetted against the faint light coming from the window. Morales took a few steps closer, repeating the command. Still no response. The closer he got, the stranger it became. The figure seemed too tall, its proportions off somehow. Its limbs were too long, and the head was tilted at a strange angle, as if it wasn't attached quite right. Morales stopped in his tracks, feeling an instinctual unease creeping in. Something wasn't right. Suddenly, the figure moved, but it wasn't a natural movement. It jerked, almost like it was glitching. One moment standing in front of the window, and then, in a blink, it was gone. Just like that. Morales' flashlight caught only the empty space where it had stood. There was no way it could have moved that fast. No sound, no footsteps, nothing. His heart raced as he swept the beam across the room. That's when he heard it, a faint voice, like a whisper, coming from behind him. He spun around, but the hallway was empty. Then came a low hum, a vibration almost, like the whole building was resonating with this strange frequency. Morales backed toward the stairwell, his instincts screaming at him to get out. As he started down the stairs, he felt something brush against his arm, like a cold hand. But when he looked, there was no one there. His skin prickled, and a chill ran down his spine despite the oppressive Miami heat outside. He didn't wait any longer. Morales bolted out of the building and back to his cruiser. He sat in the car for a good 5 minutes, trying to process what had just happened. He wasn't one to believe in ghosts or anything paranormal, but whatever that was, it wasn't human. He radioed back to dispatch, reporting the building clear, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he had been watched the entire time. In the weeks that followed, Morales started hearing other stories from officers patrolling the same area. One claimed they'd seen a tall, shadowy figure standing on the roof of the same building, staring down at them late one night. Another said they'd heard strange voices while walking past, like someone whispering their name from the darkness. None of these reports ever made it into the official logs, of course. It's the kind of thing you don't talk about if you want to keep your reputation intact. But the strangest part, the building's owner, who finally decided to have it demolished later that summer, claimed that no one had been inside for years. Not since the club shut down after a series of bizarre incidents. Patrons used to talk about seeing strange figures in the mirrors, hearing voices in the bathrooms when no one was there, and feeling cold spots in the middle of crowded dance floors. After one too many complaints, the place was closed for good. Morales never went back inside that building before it was torn down. He swore off patrolling that section of Wynwood at night, even though his superiors didn't understand why. He kept the details of what he saw mostly to himself, though a few close colleagues heard the story when he was in the mood to share. But he couldn't explain it. No one could. And even after the building was gone, some officers claimed to still see that same tall, shadowy figure standing at the lot late at night, watching, waiting. Whatever it was, it hadn't left. It was just waiting for someone else to notice.